My name is Bijan Salihizadeh. I'm a venture capital and private equity investor. I currently am a founding partner and managing director at Navimed Capital in Washington, D.C., and I invest in private healthcare companies, particularly in healthcare IT, medical technology, and healthcare services. Well, I think it's really a couple of reasons. First of all, I think it's tempting for people who start companies to believe that building a social network is easy, and well, gosh, physicians are just another group that need a social network, because that's what we need. Every group needs a social network. But actually, I think the reason a lot of these sites have not taken off is that physicians are really busy, they're deluged with data, and they're going to have an incremental couple of minutes a day to do something online. I think it's going to be very difficult, it has shown to be very difficult, to get them to actually go online and talk about the particular case or cases they saw that day. And so I think a lot of these companies have struggled with getting useful and valuable content online that will actually engage a physician and get him to come back more than once. What you've seen is that a lot of these companies have managed to get a lot of residents and fellows and junior physicians, med students, to log in, and often they're doing it by giving them gift cards and other things as an incentive to log in. I think what you don't have on a lot of these sites is kind of the very senior thought leadership of physicians actually creating and sharing content. I think that's been a huge hole. I'm not sure anyone's really solved that yet. I think there's lots of legal reasons that doctors worry about posting things online, particularly about particular patients and specific cases. I think it's most physicians have pounded into their heads the privacy of healthcare information when it comes to their patients. So I think getting them to actually share any of that information online, which is probably the most compelling content you could get an individual physician to share, something about a particular case that they've seen or been vexed by. I think it's very challenging within the context of privacy to do that. And even if they could do it, I think physicians are nervous enough about the medical legal consequences of making postings that they're in this litigious era, they're going to be quite resistant to putting things online. I think a number of the companies started out as some versions of an expert network, which has existed for a long time for investment banking analysts, hedge fund traders, venture capitalists, other investors, to get an insight into what's going on in these particularly complex healthcare situations. So for example, a number of the expert networks were started probably 8 to 10 years ago, and they gathered a number of physicians, experts in a particular area, to come in and opine to a particular investor for money about a specific drug trial and what the outcome was going to be, or about a specific medical device trial. And that business model was actually quite lucrative over the past decade, but a lot of regulatory impediments have come in the way, not the least of which is the fact that it's very tempting for a physician or another expert when they're on the phone with an investor to start to talk about things that they're not supposed to talk about, that are not supposed to be in the public domain. And you've seen some prosecutions come down the line. So I think that expert network business model is challenged, particularly because of regulatory reasons. So people have tried to move that business model online. And there are a number of companies that have been backed both in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, trying to get those physicians to have similar kinds of interactions online. I think the problem is that there continues to be the regulatory question of what can a physician say, and when you're in an online setting versus a phone call, it's even more tracked. And so maybe from the perspective of the regulator, that's good, but from the perspective of the physician, I think that's even more scary. So I put that expert network business model aside as one that's probably not going to be a growth area for the long run. Well, I think that one of the more exciting areas of companies that are healthcare and healthcare IT focused on physicians is in the area of helping hospitals manage these physicians that they're all hiring. So a really interesting statistic is that 30% of hospitals were employed, 30% of physicians were employed by hospitals just 5 years ago. Fast forward to today, and it's almost 65% of physicians that are employed by hospitals. That huge influx of physician practices that are owned by large hospital institutions has created a whole series of potential conflicts of interest. How do you manage employed and salaried physicians? And hospitals have historically had some serious challenges managing employed physicians. And so figuring out the conflicts of interest when physicians are being paid by pharmaceutical and medical device companies to enroll trials and as consultants, how to manage those consulting fees, are really important to the big academic medical centers who worry that they're going to open the New York Times one day and find out that the physicians who work for them are actually making inappropriate amounts of money from industry. So companies like Kairos in Boston, who I'm an advisor to, and others have raised venture capital money to help hospitals manage this potential conflict of interest. And that's actually turned out to be a pretty lucrative business because every hospital is very nervous. And frankly, doctors are nervous because they don't want to be caught up in something where they think they've very honestly taken part in enrolling patients for a trial, and the next thing you know, a reporter is questioning why they've made money from Pfizer or Medtronic. Look, I think a lot of people starting healthcare IT and healthcare services companies who don't come from healthcare backgrounds have real trouble. They start with great intentions, and the pitch usually goes something like this. Well, I was in another industry, for example, general IT or general social networking, and I saw, because of a personal experience, how challenging the healthcare situation is. I was in an ER and I was stuck for a day. There's always a story like that. And I decided to start a healthcare company and raise venture capital or private equity money to do it because I wanted to solve a particular pain point. That story historically has not ended well because healthcare is by definition an extremely complex, regulated, and challenging space to start a company in. And so people who come from the outside often don't understand the nuances and complexities of how the dollars flow and where the regulatory minefields are in healthcare. That's absolutely critical to being successful. So going back to a decade or more ago with companies like Healtheon, all the way to today with a number of companies that are being funded in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, with founders who've not come from healthcare or venture capital investors who've not invested in healthcare before, that sets off warning signals for me. And if you look back at the history of venture capital funding since 1980, when healthcare companies are funded by non-healthcare investors, those tend to be dramatically worse outcomes in terms of investment return, almost half as good as when healthcare companies are funded by firms who actually have invested in healthcare before. And that's an important delineation because it really tells you that folks who know healthcare tend to do better at running and investing in healthcare companies. That seems quite obvious, but it's really important because there's so much interest in healthcare data and big data in healthcare right now that you see a flood of great entrepreneurs entering the healthcare space. I hope it works out, but history says it probably will be quite challenged for a lot of those companies. I think we're actually at a really unprecedented era in healthcare. There are lots of huge forces on the healthcare system right now, not the least of which is the influx of number of patients over the age of 65, which is set to double over the next decade or so, from 40 million to 80 million. And that's going to put great strains on the system. It already is in terms of cost. I think the big innovations in healthcare will come from the places where the healthcare entrepreneurs and the large healthcare systems are. That might sound obvious, but it's actually true. I think those are places like Nashville with great health services, Minneapolis, Atlanta with a number of great healthcare IT companies over time, Cleveland, Boston with its medical centers. But it may not be that those companies come from Silicon Valley, which tends to be more of a consumer-centric culture. I love consumer healthcare. I don't think consumer healthcare there's not going to be a great, huge consumer healthcare company formed in the next decade. I wish that wasn't true, but that's just not how the dollars flow today. The dollars flow to insurers, large hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies. And I think those are the cities and the areas where the great innovations will come. As an example, I think companies that can help hospitals and physicians manage insurance risk are going to do really well. As physicians continue to be employed by hospitals and hospitals start to look more like health insurance companies, there have to be a raft of solutions that are IT and service oriented that help these hospitals manage the sickest of the sick patients so that when they're at risk for those patients, they don't all of a sudden get destroyed in terms of their bottom line and their profit because of a particularly bad set of patients who all had pneumonia and were in the hospital for 3 weeks. And those are the things that can dramatically hurt the finances of a hospital, and I think those are the places where startup companies, young companies with a deep understanding of healthcare data and finances can make a huge difference.